World leaders are examining the future of Gaza after the Israeli killing of the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. They say his death could open the door for a possible ceasefire. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the war is not over, and Hamas has ruled out the release of Israeli captives until the Israeli violence ends. So is the Western push for a post-war Gaza hasty and unrealistic? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. US President Joe Biden was in Berlin on Friday on a whirlwind trip to discuss with European allies what Washington calls an opportunity to turn the page on the war on Gaza. They expressed hope of a ceasefire and the release of Israeli captives after the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar on Wednesday. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is expected in Israel in the coming week to discuss the US plan. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's messaging so far casts a shadow on the prospect of peace on the Strip. He says the war is not over, and the reality on the ground confirms Netanyahu's assertion, with northern Gaza under weeks of siege and more Palestinians being killed every day. A senior Hamas leader has said the captives will not be released until Israel ends its assault of Gaza. So are world leaders right in their assessment of the situation of a post-Sinwar Gaza? And can they really negotiate peace? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first this report from Alex Baird.
Another day of unrelenting Israeli attacks across Gaza, and there's no end in sight. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has promised the war will continue, despite the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. But outside the region, world leaders are hoping the death could be a moment to bring peace. The leaders of France, Germany, the UK and the US met in Berlin this week, where they pushed for an end to the war on Gaza.
The death of the leader of Hamas represents a moment of justice. He had the blood of Americans and Israelis, Palestinians and Germans and so many others on his hands. I told the Prime Minister of Israel yesterday, let's also make this moment an opportunity to seek a path to peace, a better future in Gaza without Hamas.
Mit dem Tod des Hamas-Anführers Sinwar.
With the death of Hamas leader Sinwar, who was responsible for the terrible terrorist attack, hopefully the concrete chance of a ceasefire in Gaza and an agreement to release the Hamas hostages is now opening up.
But that may be a hard sell for both Israel and Hamas. Netanyahu has pledged to eliminate all of the group's leaders and says it will no longer rule in Gaza, while Hamas has said no more Israeli captives will be released until the war comes to an end.
The Hamas movement will continue until the aspirations of our people are achieved for comprehensive liberation, return, and the establishment of a Palestinian state on all Palestinian soil, with Jerusalem as its capital.
Israel's friends and allies in the West are becoming increasingly frustrated with its war on Gaza. The United States has threatened to cut off military aid unless Israel improves the humanitarian situation in Gaza within 30 days, while France has become one of the latest to call for a halt to all weapons exported to Israel for use in the Strip. But with Israel showing no signs of ending its devastating war on the Strip and siege of northern Gaza, the wait is now on to see if there will be any change for millions of Palestinians. Alex Baird, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this now with today's guests on Inside Story. In Washington, D.C., Saeed Arikat is political analyst and Washington bureau chief for Al-Quds daily newspaper. In Corsica in France, Benoit Muracciole, president of Action, Sécurité, Ethique, Républicaines, a group promoting human rights in the field of peace and security. And also in Washington, D.C., Brian Finicane, as senior advisor to the US program at the International Crisis Group. He focuses on ways of reducing reliance on military tools in US foreign policy. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on the Inside Story programme. Start with you, Brian. The White House Strategic Affairs Advisor John Kirby, who was in Berlin with President Biden, said the death of Sinwar is an inflection point. Should we be at all optimistic about the prospects of an end to the war?
Well, I think in large part it depends on what the U.S. government chooses to do at this moment. It's an inflection point if the U.S. government chooses to make it an inflection point. Certainly the rhetoric out of the Israeli government is not particularly encouraging. Netanyahu has indicated that he wants to plow ahead with the conflict in Gaza, plow ahead with the conflict in Lebanon. But the U.S. government has choices here to make, and it could choose to finally begin deploying leverage afforded by U.S. military support to Israel to try to bring about a ceasefire deal.
Well, let's look at those choices and possibilities in a moment. But I'd also first like to look at some of the important developments quickly that have happened in recent hours. Saeed, we've seen a drone launched from Lebanon, 70 kilometres all the way to near Haifa to Caesarea, where Benjamin Netanyahu has his heavily fortified seaside villa. He wasn't there at the time, but this does show us something, does it not? It's a big security breach, and it also shows us that Hezbollah are not down and out.
Yes, thank you, James, for having me. And indeed, I mean, after so many weeks of heavy bombardments, destruction, after a story was being propagated that Hezbollah is completely decimated, especially after the assassination of its leader, Nasrallah, and other leadership and so on. With this drone, we see that Hezbollah is still formidable. It has a long reach. It has effective tactics. They said, the deflecting kind of drones, and they honed in on the house. So it is very significant. It shows us that the will is there. The ability to decide to take on such a major, very profound from their point of view decision to strike the Israeli Prime Minister's residence is a big deal.
Benoit, the other development that we've seen in recent hours is the continued siege and bombardment in northern Gaza. And clearly that plays into our discussion that we're going to have about diplomacy, because it backs up the words we've had from Netanyahu. Immediately after Sinwar's death, he said, "We have before us a great opportunity to stop the axis of evil and create a different future." And more recently, after the attack on his seaside villa, he said, "We're in the war of rebirth and we're going forward to the end." So all the talk about diplomacy, it's pretty clear where Netanyahu stands. He's not ready for diplomacy at all.
Yeah, thank you, James, for having me here. We just can notice that there is a fantasy, not just for the Israeli government, to get some result with the use of force and army force. And in spite of what is going on in Gaza, still, as ICG said, it be a plausible genocide in Gaza. There is no. They may have a defense army victory, but they lost completely in the level of the politics. And we know that at the end, we need to find an agreement in the political side, in the diplomatic side. What we can see in the moment that some of government in the West countries are going to move and to question the support, unconditional support to Israel, which is really good sign. But we need to have more. We need to have a significant decision on arms transfer, because you can't make a war without arms, without weapons and ammunition, specifically ammunition, because and component and part and component on the drones, because we know now that a lot of the part of the war is going from the sky. So we need now to have a strong and rigorous stand from the West countries on arms transfer now.
Brian, I mean, you heard Benoit there say they've lost the politics, they've lost the diplomacy, the Israelis. That's right, isn't it? It's been right for a long time. It was 10 months ago that the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to demand a ceasefire. And of course, it hasn't happened. And that's most of the world. But of course, we need to focus on the Western countries that were in that General Assembly vote 10 months ago, still mainly backing Israel. How would you say Western countries' opinions have shifted since then?
Well, I think the prevailing sentiment, even in the West, is that it is time for the war to end. At least rhetorically, that is also the sentiment of the U.S. government. The question remains, however, because the U.S. is the predominant backer of Israel and enables the ongoing conflicts, the question remains whether the rhetoric from the White House, from the U.S. government, is going to be matched with action. Because, as your other guest has indicated, the continuing flow of arms enables the conflict in Gaza, enables the conflict in Lebanon. And the U.S. government has a choice whether to continue that or whether to curtail that.
Saeed, we saw in Berlin in recent hours, President Biden was meeting with the leaders of the largest European countries. Chancellor Scholz of Germany was the host. There was President Emmanuel Macron and Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK. What do you think were the dynamics of that meeting?
Well, it's, allies meeting with one another, talking about the global issues that concern them all, especially Ukraine. And of course, and the events in the last 48 hours or last 72 hours in Gaza and in Palestine and in Lebanon seem to overwhelm what is happening. So for sure, they would respond to this event according to their conduct and behavior in past years and decades and so on. Remember, these leaders have always met to come up with some sort of a solution for the Palestinian issue, only to fail. I mean, we know there's a wreckage of plans. The quartet, for instance, there's talk now in resurrecting Mr. Tony Blair, for instance, to have a major role in town. I think they all miss the point, James, because first of all, there needs to be a ceasefire immediately. And the United States could have done this, as you mentioned, back in December. So this is step one. Step two, you got to allow the Palestinians to live, to survive. You can't continue to have 400,000 people besieged and without food and using starvation as a weapon. And three, you got to stop if you are sincere about the talk of a resolution to the conflict, having a state for the Palestinians and so on. You have to move in with real tangible effort to stop the settlement process, to stop the aggression conducted by the settlers against the Palestinians in the West Bank and so on. You have to have all these things. Otherwise, it is all talk, Jane. I don't believe that things will, evolve into any kind of a resolution as long as, one, the Israelis get their way, especially with the American administration. And second, the American administration, especially in the next 3 weeks or less than that, so focused on the election, is basically hamstrung and unable to do anything.
Benoit, you're our expert on European security policy here. Let me ask you about the three European players there. Let me first perhaps start with Starmer and Scholz, because they have, until now, been pretty supportive of Israel, perhaps Germany more than the UK, but the new UK Prime Minister hesitates a bit to criticise Israel, and yet he said in his press conference at the end, the world will not tolerate any more excuses from Israel on humanitarian assistance. And both men talked about a ceasefire, although I think it's worth noting that Scholz talked about a ceasefire, but then the other day, on the anniversary of October the 7th, he was again using that word humanitarian ceasefire, which I think we all know from the last year probably means a temporary ceasefire to let aid in. So tell me about those two, and then we'll move to Macron.
But as Macron said a few days ago, that there is an hypocrisy about speaking about ceasefire and continuing the arms transfers. That was exactly that France did, as the French government did since the beginning of the Gaza war. The problem is always about the currents of all this statement of the EU government. The Germany especially share a heavy weight about the guilt of the Shoah, and they still have difficulty to deal with Israel. What we hope is like it happens in France, that civil society will stand up strongly and ask to their government to be coherent with what is going on in Gaza and in Lebanon.
Okay, Benoit, on Lebanon, Macron has been quite outspoken. And you perhaps can see in the European context, France is perhaps moving to a position that's a bit closer to Ireland and Spain, which have been very, very critical of Israel. Is Macron the man to persuade Biden it's time to use the leverage he clearly has?
No, I don't think so, because Macron lost a lot of credibility since he began to be a president in France. He changed his position very suddenly and without any consultation with his allies. The problem also in France, we have a new situation in internal politics in France, which had an impact also in the EU level. What will be important and interesting is to follow what Spain and Ireland also will push in the EU, because we know now that there is a shift in the balance of EU state politics, EU state with East country, and we know that East country are not very open to think about changing the politics toward Israel.
Okay, let me bring in Brian now on the possible model for any diplomacy, because we saw months and months, didn't we, Brian, of meetings in Cairo and Doha, and there was this model of Qatar and Egypt and the US and Israel and Hamas. Do you think we can go back to that model? Because at one point they came up with a plan. It even went to the UN Security Council that passed a resolution. Hamas said they accepted it in principle at the time. Hezbollah said they would stop firing into Israel if there was a Gaza ceasefire. And even though we were told it was originally an Israeli proposal, then Prime Minister Netanyahu came up with fresh conditions. And I've been doing very sad arithmetic. By my count, since June the 10th, when that resolution was passed, over 7,500 people in Gaza and Lebanon have been killed. Can we go back to that model, do you think? Will Netanyahu, now he thinks he's empowered, want to go back to that model?
I think it's too soon to tell. I mean, rhetorically, what we're hearing from the U.S. government is it's time to end the war. But I think the U.S. government is taking stock of where things stand now, and the dynamics may well be different. Certainly, the messages we hear from the Israeli government indicate that they are prepared to plow ahead with conflict both in Gaza and in Lebanon. I think the U.S. government is trying to assess where things stand with Hamas now that Sinwar is dead, whether the new leadership is amenable to a ceasefire deal and on what terms. I think that the U.S. government is also trying to take stock of the stance of Hezbollah, potentially towards a separate ceasefire deal. That is to say, decoupling the conflict with Israel from the Gaza conflict.
So just to interrupt you there, Brian, do you think the U.S. administration is going to want to negotiate these together or separately?
Potentially separately. I think that there's a view within the U.S. government that the conflicts involving Hezbollah and Hamas are potentially now decoupled, and they may try to address these conflicts separately. But again, I think they're taking stock in the wake of the killing of Sinwar as to where all of the conflict actors stand.
Saeed, now you are someone who covers the situation in terms of diplomacy very, very closely. Secretary of State Blinken goes back to the region, his 10th trip, by my count, since October the 7th. Is anyone holding out much hope?
Well, looking at the past effort, James, I don't think so. I mean, not on my part, but for sure we saw that the Secretary of State go there. Well, this is the 11th time, we lost count. He goes there every time there is a flicker of hope or a claimed flicker of hope. Then he goes there to see if he can bring about a ceasefire and so on. The fact of the matter is that the United States has all along been, totally backing Israel in its effort. It has not done anything to bring about any kind of viable pressure to stop the Israelis. I mean, they have been saying we want an immediate ceasefire. We want to allow things in, only to backtrack on these things. And as was mentioned, in your question, as a matter of fact, back on June 10, the Security Council, under pressure from the U.S., adopted a resolution. Hamas accepted it, only to have it rejected by Benjamin Netanyahu. And then, in vintage American fashion, they put the blame on Hamas. The fact of the matter is that if they can deliver Netanyahu and have him agree to a ceasefire and not, pursue an illusion of completely defeating Hamas, completely defeating the Palestinians, yes, we can have something substantive. But for that, the U.S. has to be able and willing, not only able and willing, to exert the kind of pressure on Israel that will make it stop the war. Only then you can have some sort of a resolution.
Said, I was saying that you are there following this very closely. You're at the State Department every single day, and we've seen you in those State Department briefings. Just to show our viewers, this was you earlier in the week when there was that attack which led to those tents being burnt and people who were burnt alive. Just listen to this.
The Gaza people wake up every day to another 100 people dead or something like this. Now, I asked you about this last week, and you said, no, we would never accept this being normalized. But in fact, it is being normalized.
It's not. What happened in that strike was horrifying. We understand the very difficult environment in which Israel operates. But the results of that strike were deeply disturbing. Mm-hmm. We all saw that video and all know that it's horrifying to see people burned to death. We have made clear our serious concerns about the matter directly to the government of Israel.
Is it horrifying enough to be considered a war crime?
So I cannot make that kind of assessment from here. As you know, Saeed, there's a process that we have to go through to assess the facts of the law when it comes to any individual determination.
Yeah. And Saeed, the reason I played that is because I detected in those answers a very significant difference in language of tone from what was being said in the UN Security Council by Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield. She talked about watching in horror as images from central Gaza poured across my screen. There are no words, simply no words to describe what we saw. And she then gave a warning to Israel. She said a quote-unquote policy of starvation in northern Gaza would be horrific and unacceptable. And Mr. Miller at the State Department podium, it was so different. Are we detecting, do you think, is it just different tone and language, or are there real divisions now in this administration?
I don't think it's real divisions. I think it's role playing, because in the end, it is the president and Tony Blinken, who's really now probably one of the most powerful people in the administration. He's all on board with the Israeli conduct and behavior. To say some words as horrifying and so on, and then stop short of doing anything. I mean, anyone can observe that this is really horrifying. People being burned alive is very horrifying, James. But not to hold them accountable to that. That is the clincher. The United States is unwilling, has always been unwilling to hold Israel accountable to anything. Israel kills Americans. They're never held to account, never brought to justice, and so on. So Israel burns people alive. They don't do anything. So Mr. Miller is the spokesman for U.S. foreign policy. So we take him at his word. They are not willing to consider this to be a war crime. They are not willing to consider any of them, the hundreds of war crimes that are being committed in Gaza, in fact, get committed day after day as a war crime. Until such a thing happens, when the U.S. would say, stop, we are going to hold you accountable. You are responsible for these war crimes. And if you don't stop, we're going to stop giving you the weapons in which you can carry on with these war crimes. Nothing will happen, James.
Brian, I mean, we need to look at the electoral timetable of the US as well, don't we? We're 2.5 weeks away from an election. Is that affecting the language and the actions of the US administration? I mean, Biden has been very reluctant to use his leverage on Israel, but is this a particularly unique moment now?
It is to some degree, and I think we see that in the recent letter sent by Secretaries Blinken and Austin to the Israeli government, threatening the potential imposition of consequences if Israel does not improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. There's a 30-day deadline attached to those potential consequences. And of course, the deadline falls after the election. I think that the administration recognizes that if Trump is elected, that any potential leverage that the U.S. government might have with Israel will be greatly diminished. And I think that there are political calculations that have gone into the willingness or lack thereof to impose consequences on Israel for its actions thus far.
But Brian, Brian, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you, Brian. But after November the 5th, Biden has no electoral cost. He has no political cost. He's going into retirement in 2 and a bit months. It doesn't really matter, does it? Whether it's Harris or Trump, he could, if he wanted, use the amazing leverage he has of money and weapons. He could stop this war. Do you think, knowing and watching Joe Biden, that he will use that power?
So I think it's a bit more complicated than that, unfortunately. If Harris is elected, I think that the president will have substantial leverage remaining to him to try to compel an end to the conflict. If Trump is elected, however, the very same power that President Biden wields, that also is available to Trump. Okay, and so Israel will know that if Biden, say, pauses or suspends U.S. arms transfers after the election, that Trump can simply resume them in January once he takes office. And we've seen this before. We saw this in Trump's first term. President Obama suspended PGM transfers, precision guided munition transfers, to Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia was using U.S. bombs to bomb civilians in Yemen. And of course, Trump resumed those weapons transfers when he took office. And the same thing could happen here as well. So I think the administration is very much aware of that. And so I think the outcome of the election will bear on what leverage the Biden administration is able to bring to bear in November.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to all our guests today, Brian Finicane, Saeed Arikat and Benoit Muracciole. More on the troubling situations in Gaza and Lebanon as our coverage continues around the clock. And remember, you can also get more reports, analysis and background on our website at aljazeera.com. Where shall we focus our Inside Story Spotlight next time? Let us know on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or contact us on X, where we are at AJ Inside Story. That's it from me, James Bays, and the team here in Doha. Please stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.